Oh, so I need to share again.
We will get started. Looks like we'll get started right about now. So
Okay.
thank you.
Can you see the screen?
Sure can.
Okay, perfect. Yes, let's get started. So hi, everyone, and welcome to our Williams lecture. My name is Sufita Fengeden, and I am the Associate Director of Graduate Studies at the MS program in Bioethics and Medical Humanities at Tulane. And I'm excited to welcome Dr. Will Kymlicka to give a talk to our faculty and students and everyone joining us today. Before I'm going to introduce him, I would like to say a few words about our sponsors. Okay. Sorry. Okay. I think that my computer is in delay, so anyway, so one more. No, this one. So the J.R. Williams series was initiated in the fall of 2013 to honor the legacy of Junior Richard Williams. He graduated from Tulane, and he was a very appreciated and loved physician in Alabama. Dr. Williams loved medicine, and he was very, very deeply dedicated to his patients. He deeply believed in the impact of spirituality on health and the positive influence on the well-being of patients. So this lecture series focuses on spirituality and ethical issues related to health. The co-sponsor of this talk is Tulane's MS in Bioethics and Medical Humanities. We have two tracks. We have the bioethics track and the medical humanities track. Both tracks focus on teaching and research, but they have a bit different focuses. So bioethics is based in philosophy, law, and policy. And the medical humanities focuses on teaching and research, but through disciplines such as anthropology, history, and the fine arts. Our students can complete our program in 1 or 2 years. It's also designed to faculty and for mid-career professionals. We have also a program which is designed to do a degree for MD students, and they can complete also our program in the first 2 years. We also offer 3 certificates, clinical ethics certificate, research ethics, and medical humanities. If you want more information about us, you can find us on the websites. You can just type Tulane Bioethics, and we also have a YouTube channel to learn bioethics. If you want more information, you can contact either Dr. Hanson or myself. We will post also our emails in case that you want to contact us later. Yes, so I want to introduce Professor Kymlicka. Professor Kymlicka is the Canada Research Chair in Political Philosophy in the Philosophy Department at Queen's University in Canada, where he has taught since 1998. He published about 9 books on multiculturalism. This is the way that I was introduced first to Professor Kymlicka, and also on animal ethics, and they were translated into 32 languages. I will mention only one book, which is the most relevant to this talk, is the co-author with Sue Donaldson of Zoopolis, A Political Theory of Animal Rights, that was published by Oxford University Press in 2011. And now this book was translated into 10 languages. He co-directs the Animal and Philosophy, Politics, Law, and Ethics research group at Queen's University, including its postdoctoral fellowship program. And he teaches courses in animal and political theory and in animal and the law. So before I hand it over to Dr. Kymlicka, I just want to mention that this talk is available for CME credit. We will post the link in the chat, so please click it and enter the required information. Also, feel free to post your questions in the chat. We will get to them at the end of the talk. So with that, I will now hand it over to you, Dr. Kymlicka, to begin the talk. And I will stop sharing.
You're muted, Dr. Kymlicka.
Sorry. Okay, can people...
We can see your screen, yes.
Okay. Yeah, so thank you for the introduction and thanks for the invitation. I'm delighted to be here to be able to share my work. This is work that I'm doing again with Sue Donaldson, and it's actually taken from the book that we're just finishing and will be submitting to Oxford University Press and published later this year. So the book is part of what's called the political turn in animal rights. And the distinctive feature of this literature is that it focuses on how animals are governed. So the relationship between humans and animals is fundamentally understood as an issue of governance. And if we ask the question about how animals are governed in our society, a really striking fact emerges, which is that they're governed through what Jess Eisen calls use typologies. So we first categorize animals according to the way we use them, and then we figure out how to regulate that use. So for example, there are no laws that govern how we interact with rabbits as such. There's one set of laws that govern how we interact with rabbits in the lab, which is a different law than governs how we interact with rabbits when they're being farmed for their fur or meat, and a different set of laws that govern how pet rabbits are governed, and another set of laws for how rabbits are governed in the zoos. So we first locate animals under these use typologies, and then we formulate laws that regulate and that facilitate our use of those animals. And what makes it possible that we govern animals through these use typologies is that animals do not have a legal status of their own. They're not considered legal subjects, let alone persons. They're property. Under the law, animals are property or resources, and that's what makes it possible for us to govern them through these use typologies. And the consequence of these facts is that animals are subject to a quite extreme form of political exclusion, by which I mean the lives of animals are intensely governed in our society, but there's no mechanism to ensure that the ways in which they're governed track their interests rather than our interests. And so as a political philosopher, to me, this is a kind of classic instance of tyranny. So one of the kind of foundational concepts in political philosophy is the idea of tyranny, and how do we distinguish legitimate governance from tyranny? And so St. Augustine famously asked, what's the difference between a legitimate state and a band of robbers, given that both take money from us forcibly, both force us to hand over money? So what distinguishes a legitimate state from a band of robbers? And Augustine's answer is, a legitimate state governs in the interests of the governed, where the band of robbers governs in its own interests. And so in relation to animals, humans are essentially a band of robbers. We govern them in our interests, not in their interests, and that's a form of tyranny. So as a political philosopher, I'm interested in the question, how would we liberate animals from this condition of tyranny? In today's talk, I want to mainly focus on domesticated animals, but let me just, in passing, say a word about wild animals, about non-domesticated wild animals. The default assumption in the animal ethics field is that liberation for wild animals will primarily take the form of simply letting them be. We just shouldn't interfere with them. We should just let them get on with their own lives. And I still think that is the kind of default assumption for what liberation means for wild animals. But it's increasingly realized that it's going to be a bit more complicated than that, that if wild animals are going to be able to live freely, they do need certain positive rights, not just rights to non-interference, but we may, for example, need to provide legal protection of their habitat. And we may also need to ensure that they have rights of mobility for migrating species. And there might also be a need for certain kind of remedial action. So humans have done so much harm to the habitat of wild animals that we may now, again, in order for them to live freely, we may need to, for example, engage in forms of rewilding. We may need to return land that we wrongfully took from wild animals and rewild it, or create corridors so that at the end of the day, wild animals can live freely on their own. So that's the way in which most people in animal ethics think about liberation for wild animals. But I want to focus on domesticated animals because I think it's more complicated. Thinking about what liberation means for domesticated animals isn't the same as for wild animals. And in particular, this idea about just letting them be, I don't think it works in the case of domesticated animals, because it's a feature of domestication that animals have been bred over generations, in some cases over centuries, to be dependent on humans. Domestication involves taking animals out of the wild and breeding them to be dependent on humans. And that means that at least for the foreseeable future, their lives are going to be intertwined with ours in a quite intense way. And there really is no way for us to avoid being involved in the governance of their lives. And so if we're going to avoid tyranny, it won't just be by letting them be, it's going to have to be about changing the way in which we govern them. But the fact that they're dependent on us raises an even deeper question about whether the concept of liberation even makes sense for domesticated animals. And some people have said no. So here's a quote from Kymlicka. This is one of the most famous or infamous quotes in animal ethics. Kymlicka said, "Domesticated animals have been bred to docility, tractability, stupidity, and dependency. And as a result, it is literally meaningless to suggest that they could be liberated. It is, to speak in hyperbole, a logical impossibility." So for Kymlicka and for many others, it's a quite common view, the domination of domesticated animals is kind of bred in the bone. They are just genetically evolved and bred so as to be incapable of liberation. So Sue and I call this the minimal animal. It's a term we take from Dominique Lastel, but in this context, what we mean by the minimal animal is that for Kymlicka and others, domesticated animals may be capable of suffering, and therefore we may need anti-cruelty laws, but they're not really capable of anything else. They're not capable of agency, of choice, of voice. They are just docile, stupid, and dependent, and incapable of being liberated. So if you adopt that view, if you accept the minimal view, this minimal animal view about domesticated animals, then and if you think liberation is impossible, we seem to be stuck with two options. One is basically the status quo. We just accept that domination is unavoidable, but we try to make sure we dominate domesticated animals in a humane way. And so we might improve our welfare legislation, our anti-cruelty provisions in order to, so we continue to govern them through these use typologies, but we just try to make sure we use them in a more humane way. But for those who think that domination is fundamentally wrong and unjust, and if they think there's no way to liberate domesticated animals, then you might also reach the conclusion that we should try to simply render domesticated animals extinct. And that's a quite common view in some strands of animal rights advocacy and theory. Gary Francione is probably the best known advocate of that view, that since domesticated animals cannot be liberated, we should render them extinct. We should stop them from reproducing so that in the future, in the animal rights utopia, there are no domesticated animals. So Sue and I are not happy with either of those two options. On our view, they're both premature. They both claim to know that there can be no liberation of domesticated animals. But on our view, that's knowing too much too soon, as the slogan goes. We don't know whether domesticated animals can achieve liberation because we've never tried. As a society, we have never made any effort to liberate domesticated animals. So in our book, what we're interested is in exploring a third option, trying to take seriously the possibility of liberation for domesticated animals. And in the book, we try to explore that through one specific strategy, which we call the membership strategy. So the thought here is really quite simple. It's that if we think again about the nature of domestication, part of what domestication means is that humans have brought animals into our society. I mean, this is literally what the word domestication means. Domestication means bringing animals into the domus, into the home, to live and work alongside us. That's historically what domestication meant. And in that sense, domesticated animals clearly are members of society. We've brought them into our society. Of course, they were brought in as a caste group to serve us, and that's the source of the domination. But they should be seen as members, and that means that the question of emancipation can be reframed as the question, can we imagine a form of social membership for domesticated animals that's emancipatory rather than tyrannical? So what would an emancipatory form of membership mean for domesticated animals? So in our view, there's kind of 3 steps or 3 dimensions to creating an emancipatory form of membership for domesticated animals. The first is we need to get domesticated animals out of these use typologies. We've got to stop categorizing animals according to our use of them and instead ask what kinds of lives do domesticated animals themselves want to lead. So that's what we call the question of freedom. Emancipatory membership would also require that they have a right to share in the benefits of social cooperation. They have contributed to the wealth of society through their labor, through their blood. They have a right now to share in the benefits of social cooperation. So, for example, things like rights to public health insurance. So we call that the issue of solidarity. And then thirdly, there would need to be some form of political enfranchisement. If they're members of society, if they're to have an emancipatory form of membership rather than tyrannical, there must be some way in which their interests steer and guide political decision-making. So we call that the issue of democracy. So freedom, solidarity, and democracy. Now, obviously, all 3 of those are just immensely complicated. And it's hard to know where even to start in trying to move towards an emancipatory form of membership. And it raises the question of where do we start? And here is where Sue and I differ a bit from some of our colleagues in the political turn, because most of our colleagues who are interested in these issues start with the question of democracy. So tyranny involves governing them in ways that doesn't track their interests. So some of our colleagues think the first step is to ensure that the interests of animals are somehow represented in formal decision-making. So how would we do that? I mean, it's obviously not going to be by giving animals the right to mark ballots or to be able to speak in parliamentary deliberation. So what would it mean to include animals in formal decision-making? Many people look to an analogy with other so-called voiceless groups, such as future generations. I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with this literature, but there's a lot of talk recently about the way, it's partly due to climate change, there's growing recognition that the decisions we make today politically have profound effect on future generations, but the interests of future generations are not formally represented in decision making. And so some people have proposed models that we would set aside a certain number of seats in the Senate or the House of Representatives for people who would speak on behalf of future generations. And some of our colleagues in the political turn have taken those models designed for the political representation of future generations and said we can use that for animals, including domesticated animals. So this would be a kind of proxy representation. We would appoint or elect certain humans who would speak on behalf of domesticated animals in the legislature. So Cochrane and Garner are there are now many theorists who have proposed models of proxy representation by humans on behalf of animals in the legislature. And you might worry about these proposals that how would we know, how would we have any trust or confidence that these representatives would in fact know what the interests are of animals, or how would we trust them to truly represent the interests of animals? Defenders of this model say that that's a good question, but it's not a fatal problem, because particularly in the case of animals, perhaps even more than for future generations, animals have really just basic interests, straightforward interests, rudimentary interests. These are quotes from people who've defended these models. And so they try to emphasize the idea that at the end of the day, it's not really so controversial what the interests of animals are. And really, at the end of the day, the most basic interest of animals is simply in not suffering. And no one can reasonably disagree with that. So there shouldn't be so much controversy in appointing people whose job would fundamentally be to represent the basic and rudimentary interests of animals in not suffering. Okay, so let's imagine we set aside 5 seats in the Senate for people who would serve as proxy representatives to speak on behalf of animals, and in particular, their basic interest in not suffering. So, I mean, I think at the end of the day, in the future, we do need some form of, we do need proxy representatives. We do need someone in legislatures to speak on behalf of animals. But I think this particular model, as it's emerged, is not really a route to liberation, in part because I don't think there's an account of freedom here amongst in the people who are defending this model. Like, one way to think of it is many of these models at the end of the day don't really challenge the minimal animal. I mean, you could imagine someone like Kymlicka, who thinks of domesticated animals as docile and stupid and dependent, agreeing that we should appoint someone in the Senate to speak about the basic interests of these stupid docile animals. There's nothing in this model that inherently challenges Kymlicka's view about animals. So in our own work, we want to set aside for the moment the question of democracy. I'll come back to that at the very end. But in our view, the first step towards liberation is not to look to democracy, but to look to freedom. That's where we think the first step needs to be taken. The first step towards liberation is to get beyond the minimal animal and to emphasize that domesticated animals have many possible lives to lead, and it's their lives to lead, and they should have some control over what kind of lives they lead. So the idea that the idea is there are many different ways of being a cow, a pig, a chicken, a dog, and domesticated animals have a right to explore different possible lives. I think that thought is probably most easily understood in relation to dogs, because we have such a long history, humans and dogs, and there's so much diversity in the way humans and dogs have interacted that I think it's kind of intuitive. We can intuitively see that there are many different possible lives for dogs. But just as an example, most dogs in North America are pets, which is to say that they're owned by a family and they live in a private household. So that's one possible life for a dog, is to be a pet, a companion animal of a family in a private home. But of course, there are many other possible lives that dogs can lead. Some dogs are therapy dogs who work in hospitals or in children's homes. There are sniffer dogs at the airport or in the military. There are dogs who live on farms or in sanctuaries and help to guard humans and animals from certain kinds of threats and predators. There are village dogs. In fact, most dogs in the global south are not pets of private families. They're kind of village dogs who may move between several different households, but are not owned by any one of them. So these are just some of the many possible lives that domesticated animals can lead. And I think we should be asking, what kinds of lives do they want to lead? And the short answer is, we have no idea. We do not know, because as a society, we've never taken upon ourselves the task of asking what kinds of lives domesticated animals want to lead. Do they want to be companions? Do they want to be engaged in work? Do they want to be in rural and city? Do they want to have interactions with other humans or with other dogs? We've never taken upon ourselves the task of asking them that question. So how would we ask domesticated animals what kinds of lives do they want to lead? That's clearly not going to take the form of giving them like a printed menu and then asking them to tick which of the different possible lives they might want to lead. Instead, we need to engage in what developmental psychologists call scaffolding. We need to gradually expose animals to different possible activities, different relationships, different landscapes, different spaces and places, and then see what kinds of activities and relationships they enjoy and what they find threatening or boring or whatever. And in this way, expose them to different possibilities and respond to their choices. That may seem abstract, but there are places in the world that are really trying to do this in practice. And one example we discuss in the book is farmed animal sanctuaries. So as you know, farmed animal sanctuaries are places that rescue animals primarily from factory farms, but also from medical labs and other places. And so here's a case in which animals have been freed from these use typologies. So for part of their life, they were governed by these use typologies as farmed animals or as lab animals. But now they've escaped, they've been rescued from these use typologies. And now the question is, what kind of lives do they want to lead now that they've been liberated from these use typologies? And some sanctuaries, not all, but some sanctuaries take it upon themselves to try to ask the animals, their animal residents, what kinds of lives they want to lead. So they try to scaffold the choices of their rescued animals. And so, for example, one question is, like, some sanctuaries simply, they predetermine that they're going to segregate domesticated animals by species. So the sheep over here, the chickens over there, the pigs here, and never the twain shall meet. But other farmed animal sanctuaries think it's the animals themselves that should be making that decision about whether they want to spend time with their own species or with members of other species. And so they go through these processes of scaffolding choices that would enable their residents to decide how much time they want to spend with conspecifics versus members of other species or with humans, but also make choices about, for example, what kind of landscapes they want to live in. Do they want to be primarily spend their time on flat pastures, which is the kind of typical farmland that we imagine, or do they want to spend time in woods? And many animal sanctuaries have been trying to create alternative physical landscapes like woods, because it turns out that many domesticated animals enjoy variety in their physical landscape and don't want to spend all their time on flat pastures. And also different kinds of work. So you can imagine variations in respect to social relationships, physical landscapes, different kinds of activities and work and labor. So I think all of this is prima facie evidence that freedom is indeed possible. There are different possible lives, and that there are ways of enabling domesticated animals to make choices amongst different possible lives. But, and this is what complicates things, and what distinguishes domesticated animals from wild animals, if domesticated animals are to have this freedom, it requires that humans be part of the process. It isn't just a matter of hands off and let them be. If domesticated animals are to have this kind of freedom, we humans need to agree to facilitate their agents, to scaffold their choices. So in the language of theory, these are philosophical theories about agency. Humans need to agree to be the bearers of their agency. We need to create what they call holding environments, in which domesticated animals would feel a certain degree of safety and security, and would therefore be able to safely explore different options. And then we would help to create the holding environments that enable them to explore options, and we would then be the bearers of we would attend to their responses. We would elicit their responses and then move forward in terms of exploring other options. So that's a quite involved process. It requires us to undertake a certain degree of positive responsiveness to domesticated animals. And the question arises, do we have a duty of justice to make this effort to create a holding environment for domesticated animals to explore different lives and then to be the bearers of their agency? So that raises the question of solidarity. Whether we have a duty of justice to enable the freedom of domesticated animals raises a question about what our duties of justice are. And so in political philosophy, we typically think of justice as operating at two different levels. They're what we call membership rights and universal rights. and these have different moral functions. So universal rights, the goal is to respond to the intrinsic moral status of others. And so the classic example here is universal human rights. There are certain things human beings owe other human beings because of the fact our shared humanity, because of our intrinsic moral status. And that gives us something like a theory of universal human rights in response to people's intrinsic moral status. But in addition to that, another level of justice involves membership rights. So this would be, if you like, what Americans owe Americans because we're American, rather than what humans owe humans because we're human. It's an ethics of membership. And it's worth pausing here for a moment, because this is really crucial to our strategy. What is the normative purpose of membership rights? Like, the goal of universal rights is to respect intrinsic moral status. But what's the purpose, the moral purpose of membership rights? As I understand it, the purpose of membership rights is to construct a shared society that's a common possession of its members. This is the normative goal of membership rights, is to create this thing, a shared society that belongs to its members. This has been the long-standing goal of most social justice movements, and the term social justice is actually, I think, informative here. Social justice is about creating a society that belongs to its members. And so I think a crucial question we confront is whether domesticated animals should be seen as part of this shared society. Should they be covered by an ethics of membership? That's to say, is our obligation of justice not only to respect their intrinsic moral status, that's the universal level of justice, but do we also have duties of justice under an ethic of membership, such that domesticated animals are seen as members of the shared society and are able to enjoy the shared society because it's their society as much as ours? That's what an ethics of membership would mean. The society belongs to them as well as to us. It's a common possession of its members, and they are members. So to my mind, this is a fundamental question. Are domesticated animals covered by an ethics of membership? And our answer in the book is yes, they are. As I read, the sociology definitions of shared society or the anthropology definitions of what a shared society is, I think domesticated animals clearly are members of a shared society, whether that's defined in terms of norms or in terms of cooperative schemes or whatever. Domesticated animals should be seen as members of a shared society. And if that's true, then we do indeed have a duty of justice to be the bearers of their agency. It's not enough for us to just wash our hands and say, let them be. We have a duty of justice to create, to think of our society as a holding environment for their agency, as well as our own agency, and how to reform things such that society belongs to both us and the domesticated animals that we've brought into society. Okay, so as I said, in my view, I mean, this may just be, I've been thinking about these issues for so long that I now view it as almost self-evident that domesticated animals are members of society. And I really have trouble understanding how one could think about a definition of society that wouldn't include domesticated animals. But that does raise a puzzle, because, we have 2,000 years of political philosophy in the Western tradition. And they have many accounts over those 2,000 years of an ethics of social membership, many accounts of what a shared society looks like. And, over those 2,000 years, virtually nobody has considered that domesticated animals are members of a shared society. So I find this actually genuinely puzzling. How is it that people for 2,000 years have been theorizing about the idea of a shared society and thinking about an ethic of social membership, and somehow managed to overlook the domesticated animals who I think clearly are members of our shared society? So so I went down a bit of a rabbit hole as part of this book, trying to figure out, like, in this 2,000-year history, how have people understood the concept of society and of social membership such that they were somehow able to overlook and exclude domesticated animals? This is a bit of a digression, but in cases of interest, it looks to me like, I mean, in many cases, people just never even raise the question whether animals could be members of society. And so it's just a kind of ideological blinder that they never even raise the question. But for those who have raised the question, and it has come up occasionally in the history of political philosophy, it seems to me that people are wavering between two different ways of thinking about the concept of society, one of which is quite expansive and one which is quite restrictive. So here's my take, just for what it's worth, on how in the history, at least in kind of recent political philosophy, people have talked about the idea of society. And I've distinguished three different ways in which people talk about society, shared society, in relatively recent political philosophy. The first is the idea of society as a scheme of social cooperation for mutual benefit. That's how John Rawls defines society. Another is the idea that society is a kind of moral covenant. It's an agreement amongst people on political principles or political values, which we then enshrine in the Constitution. So this is Habermas's idea of constitutional patriotism. And then a third idea that's more common amongst, if you like, nationalist political theorists like David Miller, that society is an intergenerational community that's brought together and united by a shared national culture and national identity. So on my view, in each of these cases, there's a way of interpreting them to exclude animals, and there's a way of interpreting them to include animals. So you think about Rawls and his idea of society as a scheme of cooperation for mutual benefit. To my mind, domesticated animals clearly are part of a scheme of cooperation. That's why we domesticated them in the first place, is because we wanted to bring them into our scheme of cooperation as beasts of burden. And I mean, they've been laboring for us for millennia. So it seems to me self-evident that domesticated animals are part of a scheme of cooperation. But Rawls excludes them on the grounds that to truly be a member of a scheme of social cooperation, he says you need to be engaged in life. You need to have what he calls normal powers. So he's excluding people with disabilities. You need to be engaged in lifetime full-time employment. That's his kind of threshold for qualifying as a member of a scheme of cooperation, is you have normal powers and you're engaged in paid employment over a lifetime. So it's true. If we define the scheme of cooperation that way, many domesticated animals will not qualify. I mean, even on that definition, we might say that, sniffer dogs at the airport would qualify, but many domesticated animals wouldn't. But of course, as I'm sure you've all immediately thought, lots of humans won't qualify as participants in a scheme of cooperation on that definition. For example, women housewives would not qualify under Rawls's definition. And so, of course, Rawls has been subject to waves of critique by feminists, by disability theorists, and by many others for his very narrow conception of what it is to be a member of a scheme of cooperation. And in response to that critique, Rawls's defenders say, yeah, well, he got that wrong. It's still, we should think about society as a scheme of cooperation, but we need to recognize that there are many different ways that people contribute to a scheme of cooperation, and that being involved in caring for children is a way of contributing to a scheme of cooperation. And of course, that's true. But then domesticated animals clearly are also going to qualify as participants in a scheme of cooperation. They too are involved in social reproduction. And that's indeed one of the reasons why we've brought them into society in the first place. And so I won't go through it, but so too with the second and the third, that we're these definitions of society, in each case, we can narrow the definition in a way that excludes domesticated animals, but is also going to exclude many humans, which I think is deeply worrisome and dangerous from the point of view of human rights and social justice. Or we can have a more inclusive conception of what a shared society is, and then domesticated animals, I think, are going to clearly qualify. Okay, so that's just a bit of a digression, but I am genuinely puzzled about how political philosophers have been defining the term society and social membership. Okay, so far I've discussed two of the three steps in a liberatory conception of social membership. The first is freedom. We need to recognize that animals have many different possible lives, and it's our task to make possible for them to make choices amongst different possible lives. And solidarity, what I'm calling an ethic of social membership, in which we view society as a common possession of both its human and animal members. Okay, if we have those two in place, now I think we can return to the question of democracy, which I set aside before. So, and now I hope it's clearer why I set it beside. So on the earlier versions that I looked at about how to include animals in democracy, the question people asked was, like, starting from the premise that animals are basically stupid, independent, and voiceless, how do we ensure that their basic rudimentary interests get counted in the legislature? And as I said, I think that's the wrong question to ask. So here is how I would rephrase the question of democratic inclusion. We should start from the premise that animals have fundamental interests in freedom and in membership. They have fundamental interests in exploring and making choices amongst different kinds of lives, and they have interests in being recognized as members of a shared society. So that's a much richer conception. That's not the minimal animal. That's, if you like, the maximal animal. That's a richer story about who domesticated animals can be. And we want to find a form of politics that is responsive to those interests, not just their interests in not suffering, but their interests in freedom and membership. And I think that's a really interesting question, in part because we do not yet know what those interests are in freedom and membership. We don't know what kinds of choices they would make. We don't even yet know how to construct the holding environments that would enable them to make those choices. We also don't know what kind of society they want to live in, what kinds of public spaces, what kinds of public goods, what kinds of public transportation. All of these fundamental questions about both individual choice about the good life and membership in society are as yet indeterminate, right? So the old question starts from the idea that we already know what animals' interests are because they're so simple and rudimentary. I'm starting from the opposite point of view. Animals have rich and sophisticated interests that we don't know. We do not yet know what those interests are. And that means that politics has to be thought about in a completely different way. It's not about the representation of simple interests that we already know. It's about politics has to be understood as a process of learning. So on our view, democratic inclusion must be first and foremost a process of social learning. We are trying to create the political conditions under which animals can reveal to us what kind of freedom and membership matters to them. And that kind of politics needs to be bottom up. This is something we need to do with animals themselves. And so in the book and in other work we've published, we've talked about it. I don't have time to go into the details, but how we could take existing roles that animals are in, for example, as a therapy dog, and create what this is taken from the field of disability, create microboards, 3 or 4 people who know that animal well, whose task would be to monitor the situation and try to make informed judgments about what kind of work, what kinds of working conditions, what kind of working relationships are most satisfying to the dog who's engaged in that labor. But we also need to what we call democratize space. We need to create physical spaces in which domesticated animals can interact with each other and with humans in spontaneous ways, freed from these use typologies, and create the conditions for unplanned, spontaneous interactions in which we can just learn new kinds of practices and relationships. And then we take the lessons that we learn from these bottom-up interactions with animals, concretely interacting with animals, and scale up to the legislature. So at the end of the day, absolutely, we need somebody in the Senate or the House of Representatives whose task would be to speak on behalf of animals. But on our view, that their task would be to listen to the lessons that emerge from these bottom-up processes of democratization. Okay, so I'm nearing the end. So the conclusion I draw is that there's no conceptual obstacle to the liberation of domesticated animals. There is a way to understand freedom, solidarity, and democracy for domesticated animals. It's not a logical contradiction to imagine a world in which domesticated animals have a liberatory form of social membership. Obviously, it's extremely complicated, and one might think it's hopelessly realistic. And so many people have responded that even if this is possible in principle, it's just utopian in practice. There would be economic costs. We've built an economy based on the exploitation of animals, so we would have to transition away from what's called the animal industrial complex. I would just say in response to that I think we need to transition away from animal agriculture anyway, because it's environmentally unsustainable. And so why not use the required transition to new ways of feeding ourselves as an opportunity to also create interspecies justice? I think a more difficult issue actually is the psychological costs. So Steven Pinker, as some of you may know, he asks about what are the limits on animal liberation. And he says that at the end of the day, we're never going to achieve animal liberation because he thinks humans have, and he views this as a matter of evolution, he says that humans are naturally carnivores. We have a natural meat lust, he says. And so at the end of the day, he thinks humans are never going to relinquish this deep-seated biological urge to eat meat and wear leather and so on. So I don't know whether that's true or not. I don't even know how one would test that proposition. I would just end by noting the irony of where we've ended up. So we started this talk with the view, with the worry that liberation for domesticated animals was impossible because of the evolution of domesticated animals, that evolution has made domesticated animals incapable of liberation. And I think that's wrong. But Pinker's view is that humans have evolved in such a way that humans are not capable of living justly with animals. So if we're not capable of justice with cows, it's not because cows are biologically limited or deficient. It's because humans cannot overcome their biological impulse to violence against animals. So I think that's a very pessimistic view. Some days I think he may be right. There are lots of trends in the world that suggest he may be right. But at the end of the day, I don't share his pessimism. I think humans we are capable of living justly with other beings on this planet. And I've tried in this paper to suggest one possible direction for moving forward. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you so much. I will, with your permission, I will handle the questions. If anybody has questions, and you already have, some people already have, please put them into the Q&A, and I will hand them as many as we can along to Dr. Kymlicka, and we'll see what answers we can get. Let me begin. The discussion here is predicated on the assumption that animals should be liberated from tyranny, which is not a universally shared premise, i.e., dominion, genesis, and might even be a minority view. So how do we get people who disagree with the foundational premise past that initial stumbling block so we can move forward? And I guess that's both a practical question and also a sort of what's the ethical grounding for the moving past that as well, maybe.
Yeah, well, it's obviously a fundamental question, and can be approached in lots of different ways. But I guess I come at it in a slightly different angle, which is that yeah, there's two ways of looking at this. One is that we are sort of naturally inclined towards these views of domination, and then the question is, how do you persuade people to adopt a more liberatory conception? But the other way of looking at it, and I think there's growing evidence for this, is that people actually that people actually do have a kind of strong intuitive understanding that animals have their own lives to lead. And then the question is, how do they justify to themselves subordinating animals? And people have to do a lot of work to rationalize and justify the way they treat animals. And so I think all of the interesting work in social psychology over the past 15 years has been studying these mechanisms, these kind of defense mechanisms that humans have to suppress their awareness that what they're doing is basically unfairly and illegitimately depriving animals of their lives. And so I actually think that it's not so much we need to persuade them of some positive view, it's that we need to interrupt these defense mechanisms. And that, I mean, which isn't necessarily any easier because these defense mechanisms go very deep. But this is a debate in the animal advocacy movement that some people say that people are basically one of the slogans is that people are kind of blocked. They're blocked vegetarians or vegans. That they're all, in one sense, they're already there, but they're just blocked from taking that step by these defense mechanisms. Yeah, I think we can look at it both ways.
And I'm basically just going in the response from the questioner that's a really helpful answer. It gets to what I was wondering about, and the question did come from a vegan. Well, there you go. As I think a more of a suggestion rather than a question. India is a great example. This is the question coming in for a society where various animals are regarded as having equal, if not superior, rights, liberties, and so on than humans. Maybe that's a place that Westerners can go to learn from and research. And I think where, especially if the question is how could we build a society, it's already been done, right?
Yeah. So great. So I mean. Absolutely, we need. So there are many societies around the world which have very different histories of human-animal relations, and there's so much to learn from other societies and cultures about, including ideas of human-animal kinship. So in some ways, the Western view that I've been critiquing is a kind of we need to provincialize Europe and recognize that there are many other ways of thinking about human-animal relations from what we can learn. Having said that, the India case is complicated. In the Western context, there is quite robust evidence that those who are committed to animal rights are also strongly committed to human rights. That these are connected, mutually reinforcing. Also, and by human rights I mean here gender equality, gay rights, disability rights, and so on. In the Indian context. One source of vegetarianism is a particular kind of Hindu religious background, and the evidence suggests that those who are most strongly attached to vegetarianism in India are actually have quite kind of conservative ethical views and are have illiberal views about caste, about gender, about sexual orientation. So one consequence of that, some of you may know, is this intensely politicized debate about cow slaughter, in which the Hindu right is making life miserable for Muslims. And it's sort of in the name of animal rights, but it's really in the name of Hindu supremacy. And so the link between animal rights and other social justice movements is a really interesting one cross-nationally.
Thank you. A quick one that I can answer, but I will also ask one quick to you. Thank you for presenting a well-organized, lucid, and thoughtful program. Will a recording of today's presentation or the slides be available? Yes, all of our Williams lectures are recorded and will be made available on the website from tulane.edu/bioethics as soon as we can get them up. Would your slides be available if people wanted to contact you? Okay.
Yeah.
Question from Avery Kohlers. Hi, Avery. Thank you for the presentation. Congratulations on your forthcoming book. The concept of enabling animals to become free seems to chime with the idea of a right to an open future. Such a right, if it does exist, seems to have an upward bound based on the life plans of parents and others. Is there a plausible upward limit on the duty to help emancipate animals, or does the fact that our relations with them are tyrannical, or rather than custodial, mean there's really no upper limit to what we can owe them?
Yeah. So thanks, Avery. Yeah. So I mean, it's a complicated question in part because it's hard to, we're at one stage. I think the question of what's required from us now in this context of kind of endless violence against domesticated animals and this long history of oppression, is quite different from, there are certain transition processes that we're going to have to go through, including remedial and compensatory processes, that to get out of the mess we're in. And I'm inclined to say that we've kind of inherited such a debt that I'm very reluctant to put any kind of upper limit on our obligations at the moment. But the future that I'm aiming towards has to be sustainable, and it has, and so there are, Rawls talks about the strains of commitment, that a just society needs to be able to sustain itself. People need to be able to accept the burdens that are involved in reproducing a just society over time. And so I guess what I would want to say is, if we're trying to imagine what this looks like 50 years from now, I think I'm quite happy with the prospect that there would need to be these kind of upper limits, but I really don't want to set them yet, given our historical debts we need to pay.
This looks like a follow-up question. So in India, animal liberation or rights or justice, bearing in mind these are all three different things, is also rooted in history and not ethics.
So there is a it's a very interesting context to explore, and like every other context, it's kind of it can't easily be summarized, and I don't want to risk oversimplifying, but so if you, let me put it this way, if you saw a cow protection society in India, you would want to look very carefully. It would not be safe to assume that the ethical grounding of a cow protection society is a generalized theory about respect for sentient beings, or a commitment to freedom, solidarity, and democracy. It could be a specific Hindu theology that is connected with some quite illiberal views. And so, there are animal rights groups and animal advocacy groups that see themselves as engaged as part of a family of social justice movements, and work together with, for example, struggles against caste. But there are other animal advocacy groups in India that are actually hand in glove with the Hindu supremacists, and yeah, you just want to look carefully to see which group you're dealing with.
At the moment, I have a final question. Nope, just got a new one. But could you comment on what seems to be an innate instinct of flight and roaming, not only amongst birds, but ground-based domesticated animals? There may be a tension between allowing freedom to roam and the obligation to offer them protection and survival. And I think that's probably a more general question as well, right?
Yeah, good. So this is partly why we talk about scaffolding. So we need to think about, if we're thinking about freedom for domesticated animals, we need to get away from the idea that this is fundamentally a matter of just kind of giving them a list of options and asking them which one to tick. It's going to be a much more complicated process of exposing them to different options under different levels of safety and experimentation. I mean, it's true that freedom involves risks for humans as for animals. And so, yeah, the safest life for humans and domesticated animals is not necessarily the best life for humans or domesticated animals. And so there are risks to expanding the range of options and choices for domesticated animals. But part of the goal of this scaffolding would be to create the conditions under which an animal who might have whose initial reaction might be a kind of fight or flight reaction, that because they come to trust a human, for example, they are therefore willing to go into a context, whether it's interacting with other people, or going into a particular physical landscape, or engaging with a particular, so they might have a fight or flight response to a particular, piece of machinery or physical infrastructure. But if they're accompanied by someone they trust, they will, overcome that initial instinct, and then they might find they really enjoy some activity or relationship that was made possible that they wouldn't have ever been exposed to if they hadn't had this kind of scaffolding. And so the goal isn't to, like, I think this is a feature of domesticated animals. And again, it differs. It's part of what distinguishes it from the case of wild animals is that, what domestication rests on the fact that we and domesticated animals have the capacity for interspecies sociability. That is a precondition of domestication, is that we have this capacity for interspecies sociability. And historically, humans have used that to oppress and exploit domesticated animals. But it's actually an incredibly exciting capacity, that the fact that humans and domesticated animals are capable of forming relationships of trust and communication makes possible a range of lives for domesticated animals that we haven't even begun to explore. But it does need to be scaffolded.
Should domestic animals be sterilized? That's sort of a part of the extinction question, but also, just one of our standard, spay and neuter your pets, right?
Yeah.
How does that fit in?
Yeah, no, I think at one point, Sue and I said that this is probably the hardest nut to crack for an animal rights theory, is reproductive rights. Some people think that animal experimentation is the hard case.
That's our next question. So
okay.
Yeah.
I thought it might come. But no, I think reproductive rights is a really hard case. So here's the story we tell, that our aim is to create a just society that responds to the interests of all of its members. We think that most domesticated animals, like most humans, have meaningful interests, strong interests in both sex and reproduction, in having forms of sexual pleasure and in caring for family relations. And so we cannot discount those to zero. They count. The story of justice has to include just acknowledgement of the interest in sex and reproduction of domesticated animals. But if we had completely unregulated reproduction, it would quickly make the whole system unsustainable. And so our hope is that there's a way of making it possible for those domesticated animals who do seem to genuinely have a desire and interest in both sex and raising offspring, to have an opportunity to do that, but that we would need to regulate the numbers. And so you could imagine that, like, every cat would have one litter, and then we might sterilize them in the interests of overall sustainability. And of course, I mean, that raises a question. Well, would we, if there are humans who were overpopulating, would we sterilize them? And so I mean, it's a really complicated question. But our goal is, so we're against automatic sterilizing, and we wouldn't want to build into our theory that humans just have the right to unilaterally suppress the reproductive rights of domesticated animals, but it needs to be sustainable.
And I teased it. Thank you for this talk. Would you elaborate more on the animals used in biomedical research? The dominion and maleficence over them are justified by assumed human interest. So how can they be liberated or extinct? What could be the steps to an interspecies future of human-animal health research industry?
Yeah. Well, so I mean, I know that's probably of particular concern to this audience. And I'm embarrassed to say that it's really not I have not myself focused primarily on the case of animals in medical research. I mean, I do think so. Here's my view, for what it's worth. I mean, I do think it's wrong to induce illness in animals for the sake of acquiring knowledge. And I don't think we have the right to view animals as just instruments or tools for medical research. And so obviously, on my view, huge whacks of the ways in which animals are used in medical research is illegitimate. I mean, I think there are forms of research that would be that does respect animal rights, and so some people have talked about. I mean, obviously, some forms of research are just basically observational in a way that isn't harmful. But people have also talked about what kind of research might be possible if we think about, and again, particularly domesticated animals, as patients. So just as with humans, sometimes people get ill and there's an experimental treatment. And so we enroll sick humans in an experimental study to see whether the new treatment works well. You could imagine the same thing with, so actually here at Queen's, at my university, so imagine you have a dog who's a hemophiliac, and so you could imagine them being enrolled in a research study to test different medicines for hemophilia. That, to my mind, is perfectly possible, and I could imagine legitimate. Here at Queen's, we have a hemophiliac dog lab in which they're inducing hemophilia in order to experiment on the animals. In my view, that's just wrong. I mean, I realize these are really controversial issues, but that's the logic of our position.
Thank you. And one comment, this is not really a question, but a comment, recognizing that animal models are problematic, so using human cells and organoids whenever possible seems to produce more accurate results. And then a question to perhaps follow up on, what about growing animals, say lab rats, for the purpose of research, because these are then not naturally occurring animals? What are the moral issues here? I mean, I think you maybe have answered that, but I'll throw it as a question anyway.
Yeah, so I mean, this is, I think this is one of the understated or often unrecognized harms of the way in which animals are used in medical research, is that it's built on this vast system of basically captive breeding of animals, and many of whom just spend their life independently. So people think that the ethical issue involved in medical research is the harm that's done to them in the experiment, but actually there's all sorts of harms that are done to animals, from the, I mean, it involves breaking up families, it involves transporting the animals and keeping them confined, all long before they actually get, subject to the experimentation. So that whole system, that whole industry of breeding of lab animals, just seems to me actually horrendous. And as well as the pain that's involved in some of the more invasive experiments.
Okay, well, I have no further open questions, so thank you so very much, Dr. Kymlicka, and as I said, we will have this posted as soon as we can. It'll maybe be a couple of days to a week, but a couple of days probably. And you offered your slides, so contact Dr. Kymlicka, or we can probably send a request along if you're interested in the slides. Thank you.
Yes. Yeah, thank you all for your questions and for your attention. And if anyone does have any follow-up, please just don't hesitate to get in touch.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you all.
Bye.
All right.